Joan and Edgar Martin Memorial Lecture, which is the main event of the Upton Forum, this year on social structure and the wealth and well-being of nations. This year marks the 17th year of the Upton Forum at Beloit College. This forum is named in honor of Miller Upton, who was the 6th president of Beloit College. Miller Upton was an advocate of the ideals of the liberal society, political freedom, the rule of law, and the promotion of peace and prosperity through the voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas. Importantly, Upton believed that the liberal arts college is the ideal place to engage in the great questions and to set the standard for civil discourse in an open society. We are honored to have Mark Granovetter, Emeritus Professor of Sociology, and the Joan Butler Ford Emeritus Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. His primary research interest is on how people, social networks, and social institutions interact and shape one another. Professor Granovetter is best known for his contributions to network theory, and in particular, his paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, in which he argues that research had ignored the role of weak ties in the diffusion of influence and information, mobility opportunities, and community organization. Although strong ties, think of those as your family and friends, may be highly motivated to help you in a job search. In fact, weak ties are much more likely to move in circles that are different from your own and therefore have access to information that is different from that which you have. His paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, has been cited over 70,000 times, and he's reminded me this week that I think it's 78,000 now, and is a top 10 article in the social sciences. Professor Granovetter followed this paper with the book, Getting a Job, A Study of Contacts and Careers, which was published by the University of Chicago Press, and the second edition is 1995. In other works, some of which we heard about today, Professor Granovetter has negotiated between over-socialized conceptions of human action and under-socialized conceptions of human action, which is the grand debate between sociologists and economists. In his 2017 book, Society and Economy, Framework and Principles, published by Harvard University, he explores the role of social networks, norms, trust, power, and institutions in the economy. He's currently working on the second volume, Society and Economy, Cases and Applications, where he uses this framework to investigate personal relations in the economy, which I believe we're going to hear about tonight, corporate governance, and the emergence of new industries, such as the American electricity industry and the high-tech industry of Silicon Valley. Without further delay, let's please welcome Professor Mark Granovetter.
What I'm going to talk about today is, in fact, a summary of, well, I need a lesson in physics, I guess, to make this stand up on a tilted surface. Well, maybe I'll just hold on to it. A chair, that might work. So what I want to talk about is a summary. Oh, that's very good. That's a very good place to put a bottle of water. It almost balanced. Okay, so what I want to talk about is a kind of earlier version of the first chapter of the second volume of Society and Economy that Laura Grube referred to. And what I want to talk about today, what I want to explore, is the balance between the formal and the informal in the economy, from the beginning of time to the present. Well, I don't know about the beginning of time. I don't really talk about cavemen or that, but let's start with the earliest. We start with the Roman Empire and we work our way up to the present. So, but when I say formal, I mean structures regulated by rules or laws, such as courts, political institutions, and organizations that have these charts of authority, you know, where you have all different levels, and anybody above you, you report to, and anyone below you, you give orders to. That's the theory, and sometimes organizations actually are like that, although I think most often they're not. And by informal, I mean personal relationships and the networks that these relationships form. So there is a body of thought in economics, in law and economics, and in economic history, arguing that modern economies require increased formality to be efficient. And the economic historian Douglas North, who I believe was a speaker in this series some years ago, so I think it's appropriate that I can stand up here and correct him. He's unfortunately no longer with us to talk back, but that won't stop me. He was, I would say, a surprise Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1993. I know he was surprised because he did tell me that. And he is a major figure in what is sometimes called the new institutional economics. And he claimed in his 1990 book called Institutions, Institutional Change, and Economic Performance that, quote, impersonal exchange with third-party enforcement has been the critical underpinning of successful modern economies. And by the way, I should say that I may refer to various books and articles in my talk, and there exists a printed copy of the talk complete with references, so you don't have to scribble down the references that I give you. You just have to ask Laura Grube for a copy of that talk, and she'll be happy to supply it, I'm sure. So what I argue today is that, quite contrary to Douglas North and some others, there is, I would say, abundant evidence that personal relationships and social networks are just as central to modern economies as they were to earlier ones, and that this centrality does not impair efficiency, which is what North was implying, but actually enhances it. So I'm going to summarize briefly some of what I would call the extensive evidence for this proposition, and which I will argue is actually consistent with our everyday experience of the economy, insofar as we have experience of the economy. And I also will spell out some of the surprising patterns that this produces. And to be clear, what I'm not arguing is that the formal has gone away or become less important. It's still with us, as we know. The courts and so on are all still with us. Instead, and I think much more interestingly, in all times and places, the economy features an intricate interweaving of the formal and the informal. And economic actors who are efficient are well aware of this, and they act accordingly. And I suggest also that one of the most striking things about personal relations in the economy is not just how important they are, but what astonishing variation there is in what kinds of personal relationships matter. And I will spell out a few of the more interesting cases, while also noting that each of these cases is discussed in a large literature, of which I can offer here only a brief and inadequate summary, although some of the references to the paper will give far more detail, more than you would want to hear today. So, and I note also, and this is a kind of a side issue for now, but let me just say it, that it matters a great deal exactly how economic actors understand one another. This is a matter that linguists refer to as semiotics. And while mutual understanding is important, there are times, it turns out, quite surprisingly, when mutual misunderstanding is even more productive? I don't have time to explore this fascinating question in my talk today, but in the paper that accompanies it, I delve a little bit further into this, and for a fascinating case study, I refer you to the historian Richard White's remarkable book, although it's a very long book, but it's still remarkable, called The Middle Ground: Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes Region from 1650 to 1815. And I think this area here around Beloit is very much part of the area that Richard White is talking about. And just to tell you quickly about this, what he argues is that French traders and Indians, when they encountered each other, you might think that they had to really understand each other in order to trade. In fact, he argues that they had very serious mutual misunderstandings, and it was those misunderstandings that made it possible for them to trade. So I just think that's a fascinating argument, and I invite you to read the book, although it's 500 or 600 pages, enormously detailed, but quite fascinating. Okay, so let me begin by cataloging some of the kinds of personal relations that matter in the economy. So one type of personal relation that has, and sometimes in places, mattered a lot is that of formal dependence, such as slavery, serfdom, and sharecropping. Slaves are, in the classic words of the sociologist Orlando Patterson, in his book called Slavery and Social Death, they are, quote, socially dead. And by that he meant that they have no legal status, they have no recognized kinship relations, and given this fact, which is relevant to all slave societies that we know about, it is remarkable, and I was actually astonished when I first learned this, that in one of the most sophisticated urban economies that has ever existed, that we know of, that of ancient Rome, both in the Republic and the Empire, virtually every business was run not by its owner, which you might expect, but by a slave or a former slave. There were slaves that had been emancipated, and they stayed in the household of the where they had been a slave, and they ran these businesses on behalf of the owner. They were, as economists would say, they were agents acting for the benefit of the principals, who were their actual or their former owners. So I was astonished to learn this. It seemed so different from anything I ever understood about how businesses are run. And the first question that you might ask, it's certainly the first question that an economist might ask, but I think it's, even though it's the first question an economist might ask, I think it's a very sensible question, is how could the owners trust them? Well, part of the answer is obviously that there were enormous power differentials that resulted from the dependence of these slaves or former slaves on their owners. But this would not be enough to assure the absence of deceit and theft. If you're really clever, then you can hide your deceit and theft, if that's really what you want to do. But it turns out that they did not behave that way, and there are many accounts suggesting that this deeply hierarchical relationship, which it certainly was cemented not only by incentives, but also by bonds of affection between the slaves or former slaves and their owners or former owners. And there's an enormous amount of documentary evidence that has been written about this. It's quite interesting. And aside from ancient Rome, there are no other slave societies that we know of that had this exact same pattern, although Virgil's story tells me that in the Bahamas, there were institutions which were different from this, but in which slaves came to have, if they paid enough money out, some surprising amount of responsibility for businesses. So that's a case I don't know anything about. Anyone who wants to know about that should ask Virgil, as I will be doing myself. But the Roman case, I think, is unique in how strong it was and how much authority these people had over these businesses. In other slave societies that we know about, for example, the American South, in the case that we all know the most about if we are Americans, many freed slaves ended up as sharecroppers. And they often had, in fact, a personal relationship to landlords, some of whom were their former owners, who offered them protection from racist authorities in the American South. And yet, this relationship was hardly one of affection. Instead, it was deeply exploitative, and there is a whole literature on how this worked out and why and how exactly it was so exploitative. So it was very, very different from the Roman pattern. Now, the other main dependency relationship, which I would talk about if I had a couple of hours, is serfdom, and it was also mainly exploitative, and typically without even the personal relationships of the American South. Now, and the reason I'm not talking about this is because the widespread institution of serfdom had so many variations that there isn't time to discuss them. I read about serfdom in Russia and serfdom in England and serfdom in France and serfdom all over the place, and it's very different in each place. So there's no easy way for me to talk about that. So if I had an extra hour, I would perhaps try, but it's very difficult to see what the commonalities were. Okay, so that's about the role of dependency in the ancient world and the medieval world. And let me then shift from that and say that there's a second type of personal relation that has, so here we are starting to catalog all the different kinds of personal relationships that matter, and it's quite a varied landscape. A second type of personal relation that has enormous economic significance are those ties between people that make possible long-distance and intergroup trade. How is it possible for people to trade over long distances with people in other places that they hardly know? Well, the importance of personal relationships across groups has been an important topic in the study of trade ever since the historian Philip Curtin published a work in 1984 called Cross-Cultural Trade in World History. And in that book, Curtin tries to help us understand how it's possible for there to be trade between cultures that are quite different from one another, which is something that has happened for many hundreds and thousands of years. So how is that possible? And it turns out that it's possible because of personal relationships, and economists actually have produced many studies showing the importance of social networks in such long-distance trade. Recent studies by historians have shown some of the intricate details of such social ties. There are several scholars, especially Shlomo Guytine, Jessica Goldberg, and Avner Greif, my colleague at Stanford, who have studied a particular case, and it's a particular case which is important not only because it's important in its own right, but because it's the very unusual case where we actually have enormously detailed information. And why do we have that detailed information? It's because there was found, almost by accident, a huge volume of documentary evidence in the basement of a synagogue in ancient Egypt. And this documentary evidence had an enormous amount of details about what kind of trading partners people had in that period. So this is a study, these are studies of Jewish traders in Islamic Egypt, predominantly in the 11th century, there is just that enormous volume of documentary evidence. And what the evidence shows, I mean, it is just, I don't want to say is exactly trader by trader, but there's just hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation. And what the evidence shows is that these traders had a mixture of strong ties to close associates, and it's remarkable that some of the close associates of these Jewish traders were actually Muslims, which is something that was highly unlikely to be the case later in Europe, but you see it in 11th century Egypt, quite remarkable. Some of their close associates were actually Muslim, and they had weaker ties to many others at some distance, sometimes at some great distance. And then I want to tell you about a remarkable study by the historian Francesca Trivelato, who's currently at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She's a well-known historian. And Trivelato shows the importance to trade of ties weaker than even I, who have talked about, as some of you know, the strength of weak ties, ties weaker than even I would ever have imagined mattered. So she examines a group that are called Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews are refugees from the Inquisition in Spain and in Portugal. And they settled in all different places in Europe, but in particular, what Trivelato studies is the Sephardic Jews who settled in a port on the west coast of Italy called Livorno, Livorno, and it's a very important port. And these traders traded all over the world, and their trading partners were of all kinds. In fact, and some of this is just astonishing. They had extensive trade with Hindu counterparties in Portuguese India, an area called Goa, which was then a Portuguese holding, whom they had never met and never expected to meet. So what kind of relationship did they have with them? They exchanged highly formal and stylized letters with them, and in fact, they were so stylized that there existed in this period etiquette manuals telling people how to compose these letters, what kinds of things you should say to the people that you wanted to establish relationships with. So how could that be the basis for a relationship is a question that is hard not to ask. And yet, they established relationships that way, and that was enough to facilitate extensive, high-value trade, including that in precious stones. So there was quite a supply of precious stones in India in this period, and they traded back and forth. These Hindu traders traded back and forth with these Jewish traders, the Sephardic Jewish traders in Livorno, and it didn't. There was never a problem with anybody trying to abscond with the merchandise for various reasons. Partly it was, of course, because you didn't want to get the reputation for being someone who did something like that, but it was also because they had established relationships with these highly formal and stylized letters. It's quite remarkable. And Trivelato's book is aptly titled The Familiarity of Strangers. Another book that I highly recommend, although again, it's kind of like the books on the Jewish traders in Islamic Egypt. It is hundreds of pages. She examined cases in such detail, only historians would have the patience for that, but it is still such a fascinating book. And in all these cases, it wasn't just a matter of social relationships. In all these cases, traders used courts. They were familiar with and sometimes used courts and judicial processes of various kinds. That was part of the picture. It was part of the toolkit that they were able to use, including in going back to 11th century Egypt. Jewish traders would sometimes take their cases to Muslim courts. There was a whole collection of different kinds of courts in this period. There were Muslim courts, there were Jewish courts, there were other kinds of local courts. So they might take their cases to Muslim courts, but they preferred Jewish courts, which are more turned out they were more lenient. And what they preferred even more, and this is what business people prefer in every place and every time that we know about, what they prefer most of all is to avoid courts if possible. Wasn't always possible, but if it was possible, that would have been their preference. But they always operated, even when they avoided courts, with the knowledge of what would happen if they had to go to court. And there is a classic law review paper by two legal scholars called Mnookin and Kornhauser, which, so what they were interested in is the fact that divorce negotiations, when couples are going to divorce, they have to carry out, of course, extensive negotiations about how to divide the property, how to divide the home, and so on and so forth, sometimes even the children. And it turned out, they found that most of those divorce negotiations were not carried out in court. They were carried out in private, but what he found when he analyzed these cases was that when these negotiations were carried out in private, the people who were negotiating were well aware of what would happen if they took the case to court. And they were careful to negotiate and carry out the division of property and so on in ways that would not get them in trouble if the case ever did come to court. So the famous expression that Mnookin and Kornhauser coined in this paper is that these divorce negotiations were carried out in the shadow of the law, which means that they knew what would happen if this had to come to court, and they were very careful not to do anything that would create a problem if it ever did come to court. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. It's a very interesting fact. So one of the things about long-distance trade, it's unique in how distant traders might be from one another. In physical distance and cultural distance and other kinds of distance, but there are many markets that are in fact highly localized, where the trade is carried out in a very small area. And in some of those places, in some of those settings, judicial systems are there, but they're not very strong. Now, there are law and economic scholars. There's a famous law professor and economist named Richard Posner, and he has a paper that was published in 1980, which is a very interesting paper. There's a reference in the written version of this. And what he proposed is that the gap in these between the fact that the judicial systems are weak, which creates a kind of gap in the way people can deal with each other, he argues that this gap is compensated for in what he called in this paper primitive societies by the dominance of personal relations in the economy. So Posner was trying to tell a story that would explain why personal relations are so important in some kinds of societies that he called primitive. So it's an argument that I will eventually be disputing, but he had a story about how in primitive societies people traded with people they know well. And he cited in particular a famous paper by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz on a bazaar, a market in Sefrou, Morocco, where people only traded with people that they knew, and they had habitual relationships with the same buyers and sellers with one another. It turns out that contrary to what Posner thought, the reality is far more complex. In settings like that, it turns out that where social networks are dense, as they are in small towns, personal trading relationships exist, but they're not that important. Just the opposite of what Posner thought. They're not that important. In fact, important matters like credit. If you're buying and selling in a market, it's very important to know whether you can afford to give credit to somebody who's buying from you. Important relationships like credit may still be instead of being regulated by the fact that you know each other, they can be narrowly contractual. And the reason that they can be narrowly contractual is that in those kinds of settings, so many people know one another that if there was a default, if people didn't pay their debts, that knowledge in that setting where the networks are pretty dense would become common knowledge, and those traders who had defaulted on their debt would not be able to trade with anybody else. They would be excluded because everybody would know about it. On the other hand, in large urban settings, and what I'm doing here, I'm actually citing a collection of studies from the Philippines about markets in the Philippines, some of which were carried out in small villages, some of them in large cities. And it turns out that in the large cities, contrary to what you'd expect, it was just the opposite, that credit may in fact be highly personalized. And the reason for that is that in these larger markets, people who default don't have to be afraid that they'll be excluded from trade because so many people live in those settings that they can still find other networks to trade in where their bad reputation has not yet traveled. So this is tremendously ironic because what we find is that contrary to what many would imagine, and certainly contrary to what Posner imagined, in large complex settings, personal relationships matter more than they do in small, simple ones. Because in those large complex settings, you can, if you default on your loan, you can always find somewhere else to trade. There's just so much going on. And so, okay, so if this seems to suggest that personal relations are dominant just exactly where they're needed, which is kind of what Posner imagined, if we think that, then we need to think twice, because there are other studies that cast doubt on this neat formula. So for example, in very high density places, as in there's a series of classic studies on the economy of the island of Java in Indonesia, it is actually hard to construct personal trading relationships because traders have too many opportunities with too many customers scattered over the landscape. And if you cheat or default, that is especially easy to hide when so many people and networks can be accessed over such a dense landscape. So what we're talking about here in the island of Java, these classic studies show that the population density is so high that there are a very large number of villages, and each one is just a couple of 100 feet from the next one. So if you default, you can easily find somewhere else where people don't know that you defaulted. So it is hard to construct personal trading relationships because you can go to so many different markets in order to trade, and if you default on a loan, you can find lots of markets in very short distances because of the high density where no one will know about your bad reputation. They might eventually find out, but by that time you can move somewhere else. So personal economic ties, that's a case that shows that it's not that personal relations dominate just where they're needed, because it's not always that easy to have these personal relationships. And if the population is dense enough, you can find somewhere else to trade, and what you did doesn't matter. And then you also need to see that personal economic ties, even when they can be created, even if you succeed in creating a personal economic tie so that you trade only with somebody else that you know and you have a kind of personal trading relationship with one another, the idea that those personal trading relations always solve economic problems is also hard to sustain once you know enough about them, because it turns out, and I think traders all over the world in these kinds of markets know this, it turns out that the stronger a personal economic tie is, the more risk it creates for the seller. For example, the harder the harder it is to collect debts or enforce contracts, because you're talking to people you have a strong personal relationship with. So it's hard to insist on collecting debts or enforcing contracts. And the buyers are well aware of this. And this may be why some of them try to make ties even stronger than they were. And for example, in Spanish-influenced cultures, one way you can make a trading tie, a personal tie to someone you are buying from, is to offer to be your trading partner's child's godparent. This is the compadre pattern in Spanish-influenced cultures. And that is a request that is difficult to refuse, because refusing that kind of request is so insulting that people are very reluctant. So it's something that can easily be manipulated to make ties stronger than they would have been otherwise, and then that puts the person you're trading with at a disadvantage, because they can't really enforce anything against you because you're now their child's godparent. So my main point here is that in many markets, personal ties matter, but they may be double-edged swords, useful in economic interchange, but also liable to be manipulated for the advantage of one party to a transaction in ways that clearly do not further economic efficiency. Okay. Well, so far, I've only talked about network ties in the economy, but there is more to say about formal matters like contracts and courts. So there's a landmark paper that was published in 1963 by a law professor at the University of Wisconsin named Stuart Macaulay. And Macaulay set out to study what he thought would be a study of how firms used the courts to resolve disputes that they had with one another. His now classic paper records his surprise that, in fact, firms did everything they could to avoid bringing a dispute to court. So there is that pattern again. Firms don't really want to bring disputes to court if they can avoid it. And nor did they deal with disputes by citing to the other party the contract that they had made, and say, you violated the contract, here's this provision in the contract, and you violated it. Instead, what they told Macaulay is, the contract was something you put in the drawer, and then you don't pay any more attention to it. If you have a dispute with another firm, you settle it because you know people in the other firms, and those personal relationships are the way that people go about resolving any disputes they have. Well, it turns out in the 21st century that this is only now partly true. So another law professor, Lisa Bernstein at the University of Chicago Law School, studied in enormous detail contracts. I think the only people who would spend a lot of time actually studying contracts are law professors, because no one else has the patience for it. So Lisa Bernstein, this University of Chicago law professor, spent a lot of time studying in great detail contracts between American Midwestern OEMs. OEM means original equipment manufacturer, and these are the companies that put together the final product that is sold on the market. And some of the cases in the Midwest would be John Deere or Kohler or Harley Davidson, and so on. And she studied the contracts between these companies and the suppliers that supplied them with the parts that they needed to put together the product that they finally sold. So the first tier suppliers are the companies that supply the parts to the company that's going to assemble it. Then there are second tier suppliers who supply the first tier suppliers. It turns out that these kind of markets are very complicated. You can go down 3 or 4 or 5 levels, and everybody's supplying parts to the next party up until you finally get to the OEM that is going to put the thing together. And like what Macaulay found, she found that firms really didn't want to go to court. And the reason that they didn't want to go to court if they had a dispute with another firm was the same reason that Macaulay found, which is that if you go to court, you might win the case or you might not win the case, but the relationship you have with that other company is over. And so if you can avoid going to court, if you can figure out a way not to go to court, then you're going to avoid it. But she also found, unlike Macaulay, that these firms did not simply put their contracts in the drawer. In fact, they drew them up very carefully, and she knew because she read every page of these contracts. I can't imagine the patience that's required to do this, but you know, it's good that we have law professors doing this. I hope there are no law professors in the audience, because I think that it's actually a very good thing. I admire it. I just couldn't do it myself. Anyway, she found they did not put their contracts in the drawer. In fact, they drew them up very carefully. Like the contracts that Macaulay mentioned, these contracts were also not mainly concerned with what violations might lead to legal action, which everyone wanted to avoid, again, just like in what Macaulay found. Instead, the contracts are designed to keep the law out of the relationship. And the way they do that, it turns out, is to encourage what she calls relational governance. In other words, what these contracts do is that they prescribe and they facilitate personal relationships between personnel of the supplier and personnel of the buyer, the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer. So the contract really creates what law professors call a private order institution. In other words, people are substituting their own action for the action of courts and the law. And the reason it works is because personal ties across firms between the first tier suppliers and the OEM firms, personal ties across firms lead to interpersonal trust, and that makes it easier to solve problems, to get accurate information, and to share technological advances. We should compare that to Oliver Williamson's idea. Oliver Williamson, as some of you know, is another economist who won a Nobel Prize for his ideas that I think I have some problems with. Compare this to Williamson's idea that if the contract you had to draw up between two companies would be really complicated, then the way you solve that problem is for the companies just to merge. And then everything that any problems are handled in the hierarchy of the merged company. Well, it's clear to me that Williamson never was engaged in business, because if he had been engaged in business, he would know that mergers are very difficult, and they often end in failure. They're very difficult to make work. And so the contract that Bernstein is talking about does not try to anticipate complicated problems, but instead it operates by encouraging personal relationships that will address the problems without the firm ever even considering a merger. They really don't want to merge if they can possibly avoid it. And OEM managers who create these contracts with their first-tier suppliers, they actually want to know the details of what the social networks look like in the supplier firms, so they can encourage the personal relations that are likely to solve problems that arise. And Bernstein proposes that one emerging driver of profitability is provisions in the contract that, to quote her now, help buyer and supplier employees cooperate as if they were employed by a single entity. But clearly they're not. They're employed by separate firms, but and they don't want to merge, but they want to be able to solve problems with their counterparties in the other firm. So the big point here is that, I have 5 minutes left, is that the formal and the personal are not separate or in opposition to one another. They're not alternatives to one another. On the contrary, they're deeply intertwined, as the formal contracts are designed to facilitate the personal ties that make inter-firm relationships possible. So proponents of new institutional economics like Williamson and North argue that formal structures and mechanisms are what make complex economies work. The cases and the arguments that I have cited suggest that the informal and the personal have at least equal importance in facilitating economic complexity. But we have to be careful not to argue that the personal and the informal never have an economic downside. Some of you may remember the Enron scandal and the kind of fraud that the Enron employees carried out were possible only because of the personal networks inside that firm that enabled people to carry out these manipulations. So when employees form personal ties, the value of those ties is likely to be divided between their firms and themselves. And the value that employees derive from these ties may sometimes be at the firm's expense. So these are what economists call principal-agent problems. And there is not much research on these problems in network formation, but let me just tell you about a recent study by a scholar named Jason Davis, who teaches at National University of Singapore, and he studied the role of personal networks in high-tech firms, and he offers a useful window on these issues. He studied high-tech companies in the US and Europe and Asia, and he suggests that his results apply to many types of complex organizations, especially when they adopt digital technologies, because digital technologies make it so much easier, ironically, to form and maintain network ties. So he identifies 4 what he calls network pathologies that managers can overcome only with difficulty. The first one is too many ties, which leads to divided attention and distraction. The second one is ties that are too weak. That just breaks my heart that he considers that a pathology. To access useful resources or to mobilize trust or commitment. The third one is when employees become a broker between different parts of an organization. They have ties to this part and that part, which can lead to entrenched brokerage monopolies because they kind of are in control of what flows between those parts of the firm, and that discourages innovation. And the last problem would be individuals with too many ties, so they become network hubs who are bottlenecks that prevent rich interaction and information flow. In Davis's study, firms without hubs outperformed those with them. Okay, so let me quickly summarize. The study by Davis, it's a very nice book, I highly recommend. It's just the beginning of sophisticated research on the pluses and minuses of informal networks in the economy. There are pluses and there are minuses. That's what Davis really shows, and how they interact with formal structures. The study of contracts and how the law and courts interact with the daily conduct of business has begun, but it still has a long way to go before we can have a full appreciation of these complicated interactions. Detailed historical studies can also shed a great deal of light on these issues. All I have tried to do today is to offer a framework that gives weight to both the formal and the informal aspects of the economy, so we can get down to the hard work of sorting out how these work together, as they always do, to create the economy that we think we are familiar with, but in fact we don't fully understand. So that's what I have to say, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Professor Granovetter, for these remarks. I have a question to get us started here. You're talking about this example of OEMs and their suppliers, right? So today, we see many examples of this, and you're using this to say that this is another part of business where they resort to legal action as a final option that they would really not.
It's a last resort.
Yes, do not want to rely on. So when you say that it's personal ties that they're using, can you tell us a little bit more about what those personal ties look like and how they're actually utilized to avoid the kind of conflict that happens in formal courts?
Well, it's actually spelled out in great detail in these contracts. You can, if you go to this literature in law reviews, you can actually read excerpts from the contract where they talk about the nature of these personal ties. The typical thing is that these first-order suppliers are selling parts, pieces of equipment, to the buyer who's going to assemble them into a final product. And so they have to understand one another. The people who are selling the parts have to understand what the final product looks like, and they have to understand each other, and they have to be able to talk to each other, and they have to know that both sides understand what the other side is doing. And so there's no problem of translating into another language or not understanding what the other party is talking about. So and the contracts are interesting because they spell out in great detail who should be associated with one another and how they should interact. And the people who are on the two sides of these contracts, they will say, and they said to the people who are studying this, that they know when there are problems that they have to get together. If it's Saturday morning, they get together on Saturday morning. So it's all very specific, and they really are quite keyed into the problems of the other side.
Hello, my name is Daria. I'm a sophomore majoring in business management and computer science. My question would be, what made you focus specifically on the topic of strengths of weak ties? Was there any person or event or paper or book that you drew your inspiration from?
What makes me focus specifically on
the topic of strengths of weak ties?
Well, some of the ties that we're talking about are weak, and some of them are relatively strong. It turns out we're talking about the ties on either side of these contracts. The thing that people are focused on in drawing up these contracts is not so much whether the ties are strong or weak, but what the nature is of the relationship, what the people in the supplier firm, where they are in the firm. Are they in a high executive position? Are they in a position of people who are actually involved in manufacturing the part? And who is the person on the other side in the original equipment manufacturer firm? Where are they? And the contracts actually look at the organization charts of these different firms. It's quite interesting to read the detail, and there's a lot of detail in these law review articles, not as much as if you actually had to read the contracts themselves, which would be only law professors want to do that. But it's possible that you could actually get copies of the contracts. You might have to write to Lisa Bernstein and say, can I get a copy of that contract? And maybe you couldn't. Maybe they're proprietary. She got special permission. But the thing that she's mainly concerned about is where the people are in the different firms who are going to be able to talk to one another. Not so much whether the ties are strong or weak, but what the functional nature of the tie is and how it connects to what part of the other organization. So it's really, these studies are really remarkably detailed. I think it's very admirable. I kind of wish that sociologists had done those studies, but I don't think sociologists have the patience to read those long, detailed contracts. So if we have law professors who have the patience to do that, then I'm very happy to piggyback on that ambition of theirs.
Daria is not in the senior seminar course, but there are other students who on their own have read your Strength of Weak Ties paper. And so she's really curious, how did you come across this topic? What motivated you to devote your time and energy to the Strength of Weak Ties when you wrote the original paper?
Well, it's a long time ago, so I have to try to get into my time machine and put myself back into the frame of mind I was in those days. And what actually got me started on that was that I was reading studies of urban neighborhoods, and there was a whole literature at that time where people talked about urban neighborhoods as being places where people were quite alienated and unhappy. And the reason they were so alienated and unhappy is that all the ties were so weak? Well, it turned out, if you read really detailed studies, that it was much more complicated than that. That there, of course, there were a lot of, and it turned out there were a lot of very strong ties, and that those were important. And there were people who lived in those neighborhoods that had been called slums by an earlier generation of theorists, and they had strong ties that made them happy, but weak ties also mattered a lot. So, for example, there's this book, and I talk about this in the article, the paper, The Strength of Weak Ties. There was a case in the West End of Boston, what was called the West End of Boston, where there was a proposal that that whole neighborhood would be demolished in order to build high-rise apartments. If any of you have ever been to Boston, there may still be a big sign. There used to be a big sign on Stura Drive advertising these high-rise apartments, and the sign said, I don't know if this sign is still there, it's been a while since I've been to Boston, but it said, if you lived here, you'd be home now. And those were luxury high-rise apartments that were built in the places where the so-called slums, where people were living very happily, were demolished because people had in that era, the 1950s and 1960s, the idea that urban renewal consisted of demolishing any housing that was substandard. So those studies emphasized how important the strong ties actually were. So that was supposed to be a corrective to the idea that all the ties in those areas were weak. And I thought that was very interesting. But I also thought that sociologists like Herbert Gans was missing the fact that the weak ties in those neighborhoods are also very important because they connect, if they exist, they connect different neighborhoods that may be themselves cohesive because of all the strong ties. And the question that Gans talked about was a very important question, which is, how could it be that these people in the West End of Boston who were so happy with their neighborhoods and with all the strong ties they had, that they were unable to resist urban renewal. They were unable to get organized to fight City Hall, to prevent this terrible outcome, which actually scattered them all over the Boston area and left them deeply unhappy. And he said that the problem was that the culture of working class Italians that he was studying just didn't lend itself to people getting organized and getting engaged in politics. And so I thought, and I said in my paper, that I thought that at least equally important was that when people were so clustered in these neighborhoods connected by strong ties, that if there were not weak ties connecting those neighborhoods, then you'd never get an organization that was powerful enough to fight City Hall. So there was an exchange. So when Herbert Gans, who was at that time a sociologist at Columbia University, where he taught for many, many years, he read the paper and he wrote me a letter explaining why he thought that he was right, but that maybe there was something that I had to say that made sense. And I wrote back to him, and we exchanged a couple of letters, and then I said, you know, this is a very interesting exchange we're having. Maybe the American Journal of Sociology, which is where my paper had been published, would be interested in publishing our exchange. And so we kind of, and we asked the journal, and they said, yes, we'd like to publish that. And we both kind of cleaned up our side of it, and it got published, and we had this discussion. But that's you know, the problem was that by the time I wrote, and even by the time Gans finished writing his book on the West End of Boston, which was a lovely book called The Urban Villagers, the neighborhood had already been torn down. The people had been scattered all over the area. So you could no longer study the networks of that neighborhood. It was gone. And so it was easy for me to say, here's what would have happened if they'd had these kinds of ties, because you couldn't go and find out whether in fact that was the case, that there weren't enough weak ties connecting neighborhoods. But Gans said that maybe that was true. He thought culture was important, but he could see that maybe there was something to be said about social networks. So we ended up in a kind of a truce. So that was, I think, a very interesting exchange, which you can read if you like. If you've read The Strength of Weak Ties, you can read that exchange, which appeared in the American Journal of Sociology in January 1974. And I think it's kind of an interesting exchange, very polite exchange. You know, sometimes you see these exchanges in journals where somebody writes in and says about a paper they read, how awful it was and all the mistakes somebody made, and it's a very unpleasant kind of exchange. But this was not like that, and the reason it wasn't like that is that it started out as private correspondence, and we were being very polite to one another, and so the exchange was a very polite exchange. So I was very pleased that we didn't have one of those nasty exchanges that you see in the journals from time to time. So that's something that you can read and judge for yourself whether it was fruitful or not.
Professor Granovetter, my name is Charles Westerberg, and in the sociology department here at Beloit College. And I just wanted to thank you for all you've shared with us over the past couple of days. I know I appreciate it, and our students appreciate it. My question has to do with...
And I didn't pay him off to say that.
No. But my question has to do with your criticism of Douglass North. And I'm actually hoping that you will confirm how I'm feeling about this, because my sense is that formal relationships and the power of formal relationships have become kind of the norm or the standard in the way that people think about how to achieve efficiency. And I'm kind of chafing under this. I feel as though, as a sociologist, I'm kind of chafing in Max Weber's iron cage of formal rationality, if you will. And so what I think that I heard from you tonight is that I should be more optimistic, that we are not, in fact, on the train to the polar night of icy darkness, but instead can feel confident that we can fall back on these informal relationships. So is that true?
Well, I think that what's true is that the informal relationships have not gone away. They continue to be important. And what's really interesting is how the informal and the formal meet one another and somehow in various ways interact together to create outcomes that are really important. So contracts are very formal documents, and yet here they are in the studies that Lisa Bernstein has carried out, prescribing how informal networks should operate between firms to help them resolve their problems. Not that they should go to court, but that they should figure out how to get their networks operating in such a way that they can solve problems. So this is a very good case, I think, of the formal and the informal working together and creating outcomes that make a lot of sense and make it easier for companies to operate. So I think that's the kind of thing that's really interesting. I think it's clear that the informal hasn't gone away, it hasn't been replaced by the formal, it's interacting with it in ways that we're just beginning to understand. And I think, so I don't know, I hope that gives some part of an answer to your question.
Yeah, so my name's Mark Mizrachi. I'm one of the visitors, and I just have a question about this Bernstein study. I assume it's fairly recent.
It's within the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm old enough to consider that recent. So that means there was a 60-year gap between Macaulay's study and her study.
That's right. Yes.
So does she go back and trace the development of these contracts? Because clearly there was some kind of a change over time. That's what you were alluding to, that there's a difference between what she found about contracts and what Macaulay had found, because now she's observing the informal relations being built right into the contract. So I'm curious as to whether there's any information about how that evolved over time when these changes occurred.
She doesn't try to dig that up. She's not even it's not clear that Macaulay was talking about the same kinds of interactions between OEM firms and first-tier suppliers. He doesn't ever quite specify what the relationship was between the firms that he's talking about. But I think that there are indications that the nature of contracts and the nature of those interactions did change over time. There's a sociologist at Columbia, you probably know, named Josh Whitford, who has looked at this kind of thing quite a bit. And I think he would say that there has been a change over the past 50 years in the direction of these contracts becoming more specific about creating networks, creating network ties that will solve problems without them ever going to court. But there's nobody who has gone back and tried to find details about what the firms were that Macaulay studied and how the interactions among firms are different now than they were then. But I think one way that they were different is that Macaulay studied firms that had relationships with other firms that were pretty local in a certain metropolitan area. And so you would have some of these executives from these different firms being in the same country clubs and knowing each other socially. And that's not the case when you talk about John Deere and its first-tier suppliers, which might be in another state. And there's no reason to think that the executives of the firms have any knowledge of each other. So the contract has to create the ties, whereas in the Macaulay situation where everything was very local, it was such a local environment that the people already knew each other if they were in big companies in these firms. So that's my guess, but I don't know for sure because we don't have, Macaulay didn't provide a lot of detail about what kind of firms they were and what kind of businesses they were in. It was just more schematic. This is the way.
His papers, there's no archive of his papers or any background material that exists from that
Not
study?
that I know of.
Okay.
You know, Josh
Whitford
one
last
has
question,
written.
then we have someone back here. Is there, if what you're saying is true, it is entirely possible that what Bernstein found today could have existed back in Macaulay's day had he studied different kinds of relations.
That's a good point. And
Yeah.
if he had studied the relationships between John Deere and his first-tier suppliers, or Caterpillar, or all these big companies and their suppliers, maybe that was true in the 1960s. Maybe it was true in the 1860s. We don't know because no one can go back and study personal relationships in the 1860s or even the 1960s, but it's quite possible. We don't know exactly when that happened.
Hey there, I'm Kipper Bromia, and first and foremost, it was very nice to have you in my social stratification class earlier today. And I would just like to ask, what are some other examples of people making weak ties into strong ties for their own benefit or for the benefit of themselves and the other party?
What are cases of people creating?
Like, you know, making the weak ties that they have between people, like that they have with other people. Are there any cases, like what other cases are there of them making that weak tie stronger for the sake of their own benefit or the mutual benefit of them and the other party? I had this sort of question from the compadre, you know, that phenomenon that keeps popping up. Yeah.
Right, the compadre relationship, asking someone to let you be the godparent of their child is a way of manipulating you into having a stronger tie than you actually wanted to have. So that's an interesting case of that. And we know about that because that was a cultural thing that the people who studied those populations recorded. Now, the people in the firm that Jason Davis studied, these high-tech firms, which are quite different from the kind of markets that where people would ask to be a godfather or godparent, are markets where it's clear that some people have consciously manipulated the situation to try to establish themselves as the kind of the central node in a network of relationships, which they had a sense, whether they clearly planned it out or understood network analysis, but they had a sense that they could make themselves powerful by putting themselves in a certain network position. And that's, I think, something that Jason Davis is very good at talking about. And so you could look there and see what he has to say about that. You have to study firms in quite a bit of detail before you can get a sense of that, before you can really understand whether people are doing that. And sometimes people aren't actually consciously manipulating the networks, but then they find themselves, for whatever reasons, in a network position, and they realize that that gives them leverage that they had no idea that they had, and then they just start to use it. And when they start to use it, they can create a bottleneck if they're the only person that connects different parts of the organization. That makes them very powerful, and people figure that out pretty quickly, and that's good for them, but it's bad for the organization. That's one of the things that Jason Davis talks about in his book very effectively.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think this will be our final question of the evening. Kevin, I'd love for you to have the final question of the evening. Okay.
All right. Hi, Professor Granovetter. Sorry. So my name is Kevin Smith. I'm in the economics and business department. And so I wanted to ask you about this compadre relationship, because this is so interesting. So if I have a trading partner, and in order to strengthen our ties, I say you have to become my child's godparent, right? To me as an economist, I'm thinking about incentives. And so I'm like, wait a minute. If you make me your child's godparent and your child inherits all of your property, then wouldn't I just get rid of you and then take everything that you have? Was that anything that happened? Did that system lead to strange incentives? Did people change their behavior because of this system?
Well, this is a very deeply ingrained pattern in some kind of Spanish influence cultures that people request to be the godparents of your child. It's usually a friendly gesture that, because you want to take responsibility for the child and you're offering your services, and because you want to cement your relationship. But there are certain situations where people can manipulate that cultural pattern for their own advantage, and then it becomes asymmetric. You say to the person that you are trading with, who may need to collect money from you because you are buying from them, for example, that you want to become their child's godparent. And then it turns out that you can't say no to that request because it would be so insulting. And in some places, some of the cases in the Philippines, for example, which is a Spanish influence culture, if you would refuse such a request, it would be so insulting that it might lead to violence. So it's something that if you have a strong sense of this, then you can manipulate it in ways that people hadn't thought of this. People thought of this as a pattern of somebody trying to help out or be friendly to your family. And because that's the usual way it works, if you can manipulate this to your own advantage, then you are putting someone at a disadvantage, and it makes it harder for them to enforce any contractual elements with you. So it's a complicated thing. It's only available in certain. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other similar kinds of patterns that you find in other cultures, but we haven't really studied that very much yet. So I think that's, there's lots of agenda that we still need to work on.
Please join me in thanking Professor Granovetter. Great. So as you walk through the doors, there are refreshments. So if you would like to grab a refreshment and then come back in to enjoy company, please by all means do that. And thank you for coming out this evening.